I'm Bethan Morgan. I don't think I actually need to add much to this. I think Tina said it all, but I work at UCL. I combine teaching and research with consultancy. Tim?
Great, and I'm Tim Jakes. I think, Tina, you said it all before. Yeah, I run a little company here in New York and have a lot of fun doing projects for clients, innovation, project management in that world. So it's really great and super excited to be here. Great,
thanks, Tim. So what we're really going to be talking today, to sum it up, our hypothesis is that modern complex projects must leverage innovation and digital leadership to be successful. Secondly, that this is changing. There's a new language and approach in large complex projects that involve all those technologies that you'll be very familiar with, AI, IoT, and so on. And in particular, we're looking at three concepts that we think are really relevant for this. So that's platforms, ecosystems, and future states. So I'm going to talk a bit about the first two, about platforms and ecosystems, and then Tim is going to talk about the future states. Thank you. So while you listen to what we're talking about, we really wanted to give you something to reflect on, and please put comments in the chat, or you can save up your thoughts and we can talk about them at the end, which is really about, is this something that you work in? Are you aware of working in platforms or ecosystems or future states development today? And we also want to know about your leadership wisdom, and that can be broken down into, you know, what is your experience? How do you, of either leading or being led? How do you approach leadership? Do you think that that's changing? So as we move into sort of digital ways, is that changing? And we're going to talk about more about what that means in platforms and ecosystems in particular. So to look first at platforms, well, what do we mean by those? So platforms are really designs or concepts, ideas of products and technological systems and transactions. And one of the easiest ways of thinking about it is this marketplace that brings together the producer and the consumer. And you will all be familiar with many types of platforms. You'll all have come across them in your everyday life. Next slide. Thank you. So one of the things that's really critical with platforms is that we think about the business model in different ways. It's this thing, platform thinking. So this diagram shows the components of a business model, and a business model is essentially the way that a firm creates and a way that a firm appropriates value. So that's really important. It's not just how we make it, it's how we capture it within a firm. And when we're introducing platform thinking, we have the sort of traditional components of the supply and demand elements of a business model, but we're really focusing as well on, well, where are our complementers? We would have been paying attention to competitors anyway in traditional management, but we can think about them in different ways. And critically, sorry, I'm being dived on by a fly, so I make occasional spasms. So critically, we're looking at open source intellectual property, and that's a really critical part of platforms. It's this open source element. So next slide, please. So a classic example that you'll all be familiar with is Airbnb. And Airbnb is an incredibly successful current platform business that has created this really complex ecosystem around it of complementers and complementary products. And we'll talk a bit more about what an ecosystem involves. I don't know if this diagram is actually legible to you. You can read the detail, but we're looking at, sort of things like the homeowner, the room owner, the room sharer, city councils, the business traveller. So on the customer side, the business traveller, the private traveller. We're also looking at things like photographers, complementary businesses. We're looking at guest services. It's impacting cleaners. So you can see there's this incredibly complex ecosystem that goes way beyond the focal firm itself, which is Airbnb. Next slide.
It's interesting about, if I can just add to that, interesting about Airbnb, we've seen, you know, and probably everyone on here has had some sort of experience with Airbnb, whether you've been a guest or a host. We're starting to see Airbnb, that model of asset ownership. It's changing right now, right? The pricing for Airbnb has gone up in many markets, right? The homeowners have added a lot of fees on, they've allowed that as well. Many municipalities have started adding taxes in, at least here in the USA, this is a big issue for local communities to add in their pardon me, their taxes for the Airbnb stays. So we're starting to see new models of this asset ownership and asset usage happen where there's sort of almost like a freemium model, right? Where you can stay in someone's house free, but provide services to that person. So for example, a pet sitting, there's a pet sitting site now where, or platform where you can sign up, pay the fee directly to the site, and then it's really just an exchange of producers and consumers who are coming together to take care of each other's pets. So these kinds of things are changing now. And so the model is really, you know, it's evolved from the sort of like room or house to now Airbnb has gone to full experiences. And now it's starting to evolve beyond that. They're seeing some price challenges. So it's interesting how it's evolved.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Tim. That platforms are almost limitless in terms of the complementers that they can touch and that they can bring in. So there's Tim just gave a great example of how Airbnb is really extending its reach and the markets that it's influencing and the complementers it's looking at. So some more platforms that you'll be really familiar with. So one of the classic ones that, you know, in the second wave was eBay. That was one of the original platform businesses that really harnessed the power of the platform. Then if you look into the third wave and you look at businesses such as Facebook, okay, fantastic. But there was a very big problem that they hadn't really thought about the business model in a clear enough way. They hadn't really thought about how they were going to appropriate the value. And we all know that that was a real problem for Facebook, particularly in its formative years. And then when we look at our current platforms, we can see this increasing sort of level of sophistication, and in particular around that they link in with the sharing economy, the gig economy. So you have businesses such as Airbnb, Uber, Didi, and so on. And I'm sure you'll be able to think of many more. So you have this evolution of the platform business model that's come around, and technology has been absolutely a driving factor, our technological abilities, as well as the business model. Go on, Tim.
Yeah, one of the things that I think maybe many of you on this webinar have seen is, you know, when we undertake large, complex projects, oftentimes it involves establishing or integrating into a platform. But it wasn't always the case, right? I mean, when Apple was first getting started, they were creating something that was unique. It was their own, you know, today we maybe call it like the walled garden, right? If you're inside the Apple environment, you know, at least back then, you really couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't use any Microsoft products. There was no internet to be able to go out and chase around things. So you had to commit to sort of one platform or another. And even at the chip level, the way the ones and zeros worked were completely different between Apple and a Microsoft engineered machine. So today, then, part of what we've been exploring and what we explored in the book chapter is this idea that when everybody wants a platform, when platforms are happening all around us all the time, what does that mean for a project manager? What kind of skills do you need to have? And this really gets to this concept of digital leadership, right? That we need to be able to articulate, not only like the requirements and the scope, but to be able to talk about sort of the business model and the value that's going to be happening in this environment that would attract players into this, and not just the consumers, but the producers as well, and the various types of suppliers and partners that would be needed.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of suppliers, and it keeps going. So actually, that's a really good point, Tim. So one of the critical aspects of this is that you see the breakdown of the traditional firm. We no longer need leaders and managers who are innovating within the company. So if you look back at the first wave, Tim made a great point that, Apple, their business model, essentially, the way they were treating competition was about locking customers in. Same with Microsoft, same with Intel, same with IBM, really. And if you then move to the fourth wave and the sort of businesses, that is no longer the case by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, quite the opposite. So that really illustrates the what I was talking about in the business model, which is this open source principle. This principle of looking beyond the firm, of sharing, and actually that being a means for innovation. Next slide, Tim, please. So that brings me neatly onto ecosystems. So actually it was Moore who described them as economic communities supported by a foundation of interacting organizations and individuals. So what does that mean really? You have your core business, you have your extended business, which you're starting to look at things like competitors, suppliers, you're starting to look at the customers as well, obviously. But then beyond that, you have the business ecosystem, which really comprises other stakeholders that you may not usually think about. And you both influence and you are influenced by them. So that's important. And actually, the next slide. So thanks, Tim. This is drawn from some research that I did with Eleni. I think if you click again, we give the source, there we go.
I think so it just goes to future state.
Yeah. So it's just that's fine, Tim. So this diagram is taking some research I did with Eleni, and it's based on the UK construction industry. And it really shows how these mega projects in the UK construction industry, so for example, the Channel Tunnel back in the 1980s, Heathrow Terminal 5, the Olympics, Crossrail, Thames Tideway, and High Speed 2, how they are both shaped by and shape the evolution of this ecosystem. So that's really starts to identify actually these projects, particularly large, complex projects, which we're looking at, formed as shape, have a really important role in the evolution and the creation of these ecosystems. So that's just talking briefly about platforms and ecosystems. Tim, should we move on to future states?
Sure. So I just before we leave this slide, Beth, Julian Denicol, who is another IPMA special interest group leader, he just completed I think it was a paper on mega projects, supply chains, which if you get a chance, go hunt down Julian Denicol, and he works actually with Beth and Eleni, and he is I think it's a really interesting take on sort of platform thinking, right? How you manage supply chains in a really large effort where it's consumption heavy and you have to sort of manage it across the platform. So just a thought for everyone. So let's jump into future states here, guys. So what is a future state? So when we think about platforms and ecosystems, these are two areas that project managers are involved in a lot, right? We are building out digital platforms, right, for customers or within our organizations. And we're also trying to link into a larger community of suppliers and partners in the form of kind of a business ecosystem. So the third component to this is this idea of a future state, which is a disruptive concept. This is really about how we compete and how we compete in the future state. So I want to walk you through maybe kind of a thought experiment, if you will, on how we develop a future state. So here's the definition. It's a concept for how the business interacts with customers, competitors, suppliers in the world, typically evolved through a series of incremental launches. So what happens here, and you can see the graphic here, we have a future state over here, and then we've got these various launches, and I'll talk about sort of how that works in just a moment. But I think the idea here is that when we are, rather than say a traditional project scope, from an innovation perspective, what we're really trying to do is to understand where are we going to be and what does the world look like at that point, right? So when we can build out that future state out here all the way to the right, what we can then do is come back, and this first launch might be a project that gets us to that future state. So let me walk you through this really quickly. So there's this concept of NEWTONIAN thinking, all right, which means, and this was really prevalent in World War II. So in World War II, we went from, we had to produce all kinds of things for a lot of people. It was an economic boom time after the war, through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And what led up to that, of course, was the Industrial Revolution, right? So around the world, we saw factories sprouting up everywhere, and this idea of sort of creating new products. So imagine for a second that you are a shoe maker. You just make brown shoes. Well, at some point, your market is saturated, right? Everyone has a brown shoe. And so what do? Well, you create a black shoe. And at some point, all of the buyers of the brown shoes and the black shoes, they have their shoes. They don't buy anymore. So maybe at some point you consider, well, geez, there are these people who are out exercising. Perhaps I should get an athletic shoe, and again, a waterproof shoe. And so what in the classic sort of innovation style, how we expand our market, how we evolve our products, is through this sort of incremental approach. We start with one form factor, and then we evolve to the next and to the next and to the next. And so it's incremental solutions. Today, what we see is more around this idea of what I would call Einsteinian thinking. And what Einsteinian thinking really is mass customization. And what that creates is disruptive. So imagine you're that same shoemaker, and you think, how am I going to grow my business? So the way I'm going to grow my business, one thing I know really well is I know how to dress people. I know from the shoe perspective, but I'm involved in that industry. So what I might do is come up with this concept of lifelong fashion. I want to be involved not only in their shoe choices, but also in their clothing choices as well. So how do I get to lifelong fashion if I'm a shoemaker? Well, I'm not just going to invest all my money into this big, huge thing and make a high risk gamble that way. What I'm really going to do is I'm going to, once I have some clarity around what that big play is, I'm going to start with maybe consolidating some myself and maybe some of my competitors in the shoe space. And this will be interesting because these shoemakers may not understand what I'm doing, right? Why would I be selling their shoes? And then I'm going to transition that into fashion at my fingertips, right? How can I now expand from shoes to pants and shirts? And maybe I'll expand from ladies then to men's, and maybe then eventually children. And that's more incremental, but what we're starting to do is to build our knowledge and know-how of overall fashion. At that point, then I might add in services. So consulting, right? Can we have somebody who could dress you, right? Who could do this virtually, even look at you and say, ah, you look like this kind of a style or that kind of a style. And then eventually we get into VR fittings and alterations. Sounds familiar, yeah? There are businesses out there that look like this. And so, you know, I'm thinking of a company called Stitch Fix. Stitch Fix, of course, will give you a clothing subscription. And they have a very powerful engine that will not only match you to the right clothing every month, 5 pieces of clothing if you desire, but also matches your choices based on availability of the clothing, the geographic whereabouts of that clothing when it's produced and how it gets to you. So it's a really, really powerful tool that they've developed for matching an individual with clothing. So that's an example, but just imagine you're a lonely shoemaker and now you've got this big dream. So we've developed a series of launches, and each one of these launches might be a project, might be an iteration of some sort. The real value of thinking like this. So in the traditional way of thinking about innovation, we see that there's a lot of wheel spinning, right? You're not really elevating. What you're doing is your product goes up and then it goes back down. And then you introduce a new product and it goes up and you get a nice bump in revenue and then it goes back down. Why is that? Because your competitors also understand, oh, now we're going to do a black shoe. Now we're going to do an athletic shoe. It's predictable to your competitors. And oftentimes it's not very interesting for your customers. There's a certain amount of predictability with your customers as well. And you can see this in products today, right? There are products where, particularly in the app space, where there's this sort of constant churning of new features that comes out. And when one type of app does a particular feature, another similar app will do a similar feature. And so these things happen, this happens all the time. It creates chaos. When we're really dealing with this kind of thinking, this sort of future state thinking, what we're really doing is we're elevating the volume of our sales and our revenue over time because it's unpredictable. And because every time we're adding a new value component into the equation. So our business model that Beth was talking about earlier changes with each one of these, the type of value, the type of suppliers, the type of consumers that we're reaching, all of that changes over time. And so where this sort of incremental innovation approach can attract new customers, this approach always attracts new customers. So when we're from a project perspective, when we're starting to think about these sort of big, complex changes, we want to get to that place where we're really thinking very large, but then de-risking that process by going into a series of smaller launches. So that's the basic concept. It's 8:30. So Tina, I'll keep going here for just another few minutes. I want to give one example, and then we can jump into some questions. Sounds good?
Yes, great, thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about Amazon real quick. Amazon is really interesting because we don't all have to be like Amazon, but what they offer to the world in terms of a lesson and many lessons around innovation is interesting. And so Amazon has made it their mission to change every single market that they go into, every single market. So when you think about where they started, it was books out of Jeff Bezos' garage, and you know, even to the point where if somebody ordered a book off of their website and they didn't have the book, they would have people who would run down to the bookstore, buy the book, and then they would ship that book at a loss to that person, just so that that person would come back to their website. I was early 2000s thinking, and even 1990s thinking around, you know, that profits don't matter. Really what matters is volume. And Amazon operated at a loss for many years. But one of the things that they did was through their growth, they changed the way books are sold. And to the point where Borders and other chains all around the world, this is a retail chain here in the US that was one of the absolute dominant booksellers, big box booksellers throughout the 2000s, and they are a fraction of what they used to be. They've been now bought and sold in private equity many times. There's a handful of the stores compared to what it used to be. But they didn't stop there. Amazon kept going, and they changed the way that books, the way book paper is made, right? Because and the way books are created, because when we aren't making as many, we have to be more efficient. And when Amazon is demanding a lower price per book, it creates changes in the paper industry. It also created changes in the publishing industry because Amazon created a publishing house that, you know, competed with Random House. So their algorithm would promote certain titles and not promote other certain titles. And so if you were Random House or another publishing house, you had to work with Amazon to get your titles to the top of the list. And as well, they with the advent of the Kindle, just recreated the whole book market, how people are actually reading. So that's just one example, but it doesn't, of course, they didn't stop there, right? They changed logistics and how fulfillment happens through Prime Air and these vans that are all over the world now. They changed the contracting and pricing. Now here in the US, we have the US Postal Service. They changed the entire economic schema of the US Postal Service, which is one of the largest organizations in the entire world. It's just an absolute, it's a small country of people. And Amazon has managed to change how they contract, how they do their work. But they didn't stop there, right? They are now in our homes. And this idea of Alexa as being a device that we can think it and say it, and it appears on the TV. This is revolutionizing the way that we think about how we get things. I can ask Alexa for my groceries, and my groceries will show up at the door, right? And so they are really displacing a lot of these traditional services here that HBO, Netflix, and Disney have come to the world with. And just to keep going here a little bit more, even in the space of retail, so clothing and electronics, Amazon Essentials, Amazon Basics are, you know, their own brands now. So they are, so if you're Dell, you sell through Amazon, but also you sell on your own website. And also Amazon Essentials has a whole bunch of other computing, you know, retail computing options. So there's an awful lot that can happen there. And then finally, in the business space, in the B2B space with AWS, they've really challenged the traditional players, IBM and Microsoft and Oracle. in how cloud computing happens. And so it's a really, really powerful model that Amazon has. Now, we don't all have to be Amazon, but one of the things that we can take from this is that they have developed the method, this sort of modern method of disrupting a space through sort of envisioning a future state and bringing that to fruition through a series of iterations. And when they get to that point, they truly are in a dominant position in the market. So that's just a quick example. Let me just turn this over to you, and then we'll wrap up here.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That was fascinating. I was lost in thought about Amazon. And actually, I might ask you a few questions about that. So let's just wrap this up and talk about digital leadership. So we've presented a vision of the platforms and ecosystems, what's happening now. Tim's talked about innovation through future states. So what we really want to wrap up with, and we really want your thoughts on, is the leadership question. And the leadership question is really important. When we're talking about leaders, I should say we're not just talking about C-suite execs. Really critically for you guys, we're talking about project leaders as well. So actually the table that you're looking at now is taken from a MIT Sloan Management Review article. I can set, if you're interested, I can send you the site for it, the reference for it. But this is a result of a survey that was, it was carried out over 10,000 people. It was a huge, so it's a really robust survey. And it was really asking, well, what's different? What's the most important skill that organizational leaders need to succeed in this digital workplace? So number one was transformative vision, that they really need to have this knowledge of market and trends. They need to be this problem solver. And then the second one, and this ties in really closely with future states, is they need to be forward-looking. They need to have a clear vision. They need to have foresight. They need to have a sound strategy. I'm not going to go through all of them, but number three is worthy of some discussion, which is this issue, which will resonate with a lot of you, which is that we need our leaders, digital leaders, to understand technology. There's a phrase that I think a lot of you will be familiar with, which is digital literacy. So it was actually Paul Glassett who was talking about this, who coined this phrase first. And he talked about mastering actually, it's not keyboard strokes, it's wisdom. That's what we need our leaders to know. We need them to know enough to make good decisions. We don't expect them to actually do the programming, but we want them to make informed decisions. So that's what we know digital leadership's now. So from your experience and what we've been talking about today, we'd be really interested to hear if you agree with that, if you disagree with that, if there's anything missing from that in terms of the skills you need. Tim, next slide. I think I'm not sure how many more slides we've got. So yeah, when we're looking at, I talked about this, we know that teams are becoming increasingly important across platform leaders, ecosystem leaders, and future states. We know that teams are increasingly important, and actually Elaine and I are working on a really critical aspect of digital leadership at the moment, which is how you develop those capabilities within teams and how you develop psychological safety, which is a term a lot of you will have come across. Next slide. So yeah, we're interested. What's your takeaways from today? What has surprised you? What have you learned? Tim, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, so I would just say, if you have a question or a comment, if you have a different take on what we've been talking about here, please put it in the Q&A, and we'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So
yes, yeah. And so Tana, how would you like to handle
Perfect.
Q&A?
Thank you so much for your presentation. Maybe you can stop sharing screen so that our participants can see you better. Perfect. And please just ask your questions in Q&A part, and then I will read them. But also I have one question. Since I'm the moderator, I will give myself the opportunity to ask you. Just kidding, giving a few moments to our attendees to write.
Yeah.
But do you have some advice for managers? How can they really motivate their employees to really work together, to share their ideas and knowledge? Because we know sometimes they are a bit afraid of external knowledge.
Yeah.
And how can you motivate them to really use these advanced technologies?
Great
Yeah.
question. Thank you. Yeah. Beth, you wanna?
So, well, thanks, Tim. So I was just going to tie that in. That's a really good question, Tina, but tie it in with the research that we're doing at the moment and this issue around psychological safety, which really describes that. And so Eleni and I in particular do a lot of work around digital leadership with executives, with postgraduate students. And time again, this issue, particularly in digital teams, comes up of how do we create the right environment as a leader? How do we create the right environment? So exactly what you described, people feel safe enough to talk up, that they're not going to be blamed, that we have a acceptance of failure, which is absolutely implicit in innovation. There's always that risk there. So I think that's a really key skill that leaders, we know that leaders need to develop more and more. Tim?
I would add to that, I think the equation changes over the course of development. What it takes to lead a team in early development. I mean, if you think of the forming, storming, norming, performing, you know, what leader, are you familiar with this, Tina? Yeah. So I think that it's a much more of a maybe commanding style early on, I think, right? You're giving more, you're building more around that model of psychological safety. And as the team evolves through and begins to take on more work, and really through that critical and super important phase of storming, which is essential to a team's growth, what you get to, I think the leadership model has to change. And I see a lot of times as leaders, we come into this with one set of skills, and we don't necessarily always recognize when it's time to change our mode of operation. So, I might always be, commanding style, or I might always be very deliberative and want to think about everything. And that might work in the beginning, but as we move through, I might need to be giving up some of my power and some of my thinking there to the team. So, yeah.
Really good point, Tim.
Yeah. The next question is, what are some key considerations and challenges that organizations face when adopting these platform business models for digital leadership, but also for innovation?
Ask that one more time. Sorry. What are some
key challenges that organizations face when adopting platform business models?
Yeah. And I think that one is, it's legacy businesses are not built around business model thinking a lot, right? Legacy businesses are built around a product or a vision. And when we really start to think about it in terms of what value is going to what kind of consumer, how are we delivering that value, it really can, it bends your brain in a different way. And so the challenge, one of the main challenges I've seen is integrating the stakeholders into this way of thinking. So getting, in my experience, what it really comes down to is getting permission to innovate in a new way. And we have to get permission from leadership and from our stakeholders and even from our customers. So there are lots of tools to get to getting permission, right? One of the tools that I use a lot is to use analytics up front. I want to understand where we are in the marketplace and be very clear about what are those challenges that the business is facing because we are relying on an old business model. And those kinds of conversations are very helpful for creating that alignment and permission to sort of now turn around and sort of face another direction and say, okay, we're going to go and build something new.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So actually, if I could just add to that, Tim, I think one of the key challenges that businesses face is that you are looking beyond the organization. You're looking outside of the firm. And I think so many managers are used to the traditional way, which is being like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And actually platform business models and looking ecosystems, it demands that you think beyond the firm. And the second thing I was going to add to that actually is that it really changes our view of what a leader is for. That maybe we've all come across leaders that are all about glory, sort of egotistical leaders. You know, this is what I've done, this is what I've done. And actually what we need is leaders who can allow their team, who can support their team, who can support their people. And that's the most effective way to get innovation. So I think those are two really key challenges that we're going to see from this way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
One of the great tools in design thinking is empathy mapping. And I think to your point, Beth, empathy mapping is such a great tool. And I think project managers don't use it enough. We tend to think of it more in the space of product managers. But I think project managers would benefit tremendously from employing empathy maps, because it does break down the ego equation. It gets us into the space of what is my customer thinking, feeling, saying, doing, and how do I really channel that their problem, you know, into my solution. You know, I heard a great statement from a customer not long ago. She said, we have to fall in love with our customers' problems. And until you've really fallen in love with their problems, you can't really understand like what the solution has to look like. It resonated with me.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question is, what are the best ways product leaders can create successful digital transformation?
Product leaders?
For a product leaders.
Yeah. That's a big question. That's a really big question. Who asked that? Come on.
Your point from the beginning.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot to that. I like to think in roadmaps and architectures. And you can see this in what Beth and Eleni and I have been thinking about here. So when I say roadmap, I don't necessarily mean a project plan. I like to think in longer spans and in you know, here's what happens in this phase and what are the critical elements that we have to get to in these phases. And complementing that is this idea of an architecture. So, you know, digital transformation in my mind starts with a business proposition and an architecture. It does not start with technology in my experience. The ones that the digital transformations that begin in the space of what technologies are we going to adopt typically are very short-sighted and have to be overhauled. When we start from the perspective of a platform or, and sort of a digital architecture, like where are we going with our business, then we have this sort of flexibility. And so digital transformation always begins from a business proposition. And I think project managers and product managers would do well to start from that perspective and then grow into that. Right now, I'm working on a smart cities project. And it's funny because there are a lot of vendors involved in a smart cities project, and they all want to push this monitoring device or this type of technology here or there. And there's so many of these things. And none of that stuff really should be coming into this conversation early in the process, right? Really what we're talking about is citizens living in an environment. And what does that really mean? What kind of policy do we need? What kind of engagement do we want from people? Where are they engaging? Once we understand those use cases, in my opinion anyway, then we can begin to go down the path of, okay, so what sorts of technologies support that?
Yeah. So actually, Tim, to add to that, I've just written, I think, the same thing, that one of the problems with technology, well, is what I call the sort of slack jaw phenomenon with technology, where you go, oh my God, you can do this. That's amazing. But actually, that's not the starting point. The starting point is the business. Always. Technology is an enabler. And all too often we think about it the wrong way around. The second thing I think is that is often that so if we're looking at digital transformation, we've got the technology, but we've also got the people and the processes. And all too often, the people and the processes are ignored. So, for example, a leader will invest in digital technology for really good reasons. He's thought about or she has thought about the business problem, but they don't then look at the adoption piece. And it's only when you adopt a technology that you get value out of it, obviously. So if it's digital transformation and a project leader and how they maximize it, it's looking at all three of those elements, I think.
Yeah.
Good question, though.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you. Do you think all these examples you talked about Amazon, but for example, in some other more mature industry, is it possible for them to really transform and to really implement these digital technologies?
Yes, we are seeing this all the time. And Airbnb is creating a revolution in the hotel business, right? Hotel business is old as we know, right? Having people come to a location and stay there. Well, if you look at Marriott today, the way that they are, the way the economics work for this huge asset base is changing very much, so that they are able to be more flexible with how that works. The way that they are engaging people is much more flexible. There's Marriott Bonvoy, which all comes out of this digital revolution, where it's all about how do I have a credit card and I have a membership level and I have and that all translates into my in-room experience and how I'm greeted at the front desk. All of those things work together to create this kind of seamless experience, sometimes seamless, sometimes not. But these, I think that's an example of where, when forced, when really threatened to their core, this stuff really creates new change. It takes enlightened leadership. We see businesses, and so just to sort of point forward, when we think about ChatGPT, right? Ad agencies around the world are absolutely, they're laying off people, they're changing their entire game plan. We're seeing a lot of companies that were contracting with ad agencies to write copy and marketing firms to write copy for them and do all that. They're now bringing that function in-house because they can use these new machine learned engines for content development. Well, there's going to be some more, this is going to spur some innovation in this space to where we're going to begin to see new ways of coming at customers. This is just the beginning of something much bigger in terms of consumer engagement, and how we deploy. ChatGPT right now is sort of a parlor trick. It's like, let's go look at it, and figure out what it can do for me. But soon this will be something that's very integral to our lives. And from that will come whole new industries and whole new ways of thinking about how we engage our customers.
Mm. So I think, Tina, my short addition would be, if they don't, they're going to end up out of business. That's the simple answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. Well, if there is no more question, I would like to thank both Tim and Beth and ask you if you have maybe some final takeaways, or do you want to conclude with some thoughts and ideas of yours?
So thanks, Tina. Thank you. And before I hand over to Tim, actually, I wanted something that has just been going through my mind as I've been listening to this presentation, and in particular listening to Tim talking about Amazon. And it's a takeaway. I don't know the answer to this. It's just something to think about, is the dark side of technology, the other side of digital transformation, whether this is actually all. Are we really thinking about whether this is a good thing to happen? Mm. Do we really want this to happen? And that is very much food for thought. It's a big issue, and it's something that you will have thought about before, and I'm thinking about. But just listening to the growth of Amazon sort of underlined to me, actually, hang on, this is not necessarily all good. So that's a very negative note to finish on. Tim, you can bring.
All right, I'll end it on a hopeful note, maybe.
Yeah.
And I'll just say this: in my experience, the best place for a project or product manager, a digital leader to be, is in a place of curiosity. I think that when we come to these very complex questions, and it's scary, and it's, many people have a lot of desires and points of view and opinions about this. I think if we come with listening ears and a perspective of curiosity, that solves so much, because we're not adding to the chaos. There's a great pearl of wisdom I learned once, which is, if the person with the best questions in the room controls the conversation. And so I think if we can all come into the room with better questions, we get better answers.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your really willingness to share with us your ideas. And hopefully we will have time to read the whole chapter from your book. And I would like to thank the participants also for lovely questions and for your time. And
thank you all very much.
Yeah, and as you know, you will receive digital badges on your email, so that it is a proof that you actually attended this webinar. And also all of this is recorded, so in 1 week, let's say, it will also be online, so that you can watch this again if you want to. Thank you all. Tim and Beth, hope to see you soon, maybe even in Sevilla, Spain, where
Lovely.
we'll have the opportunity to talk more about this topic. And have a lovely day.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Take care,
Thank
everybody.
you all for your time.